if we talk about the year anniversary, to me, this was building for weeks, if not months. The press is really anxious, I think, to bury Joe Biden after 1 year. And we are really, I think, with the year anniversary, we're kind of at the groupthink cascade of this. Everybody's saying the exact same thing. Everyone's writing the same piece. And it's all doomsday stuff. Yes, Biden's poll numbers are down, 6-7 points in the last half year. Yes, COVID is became back in the headlines and things this year. So, I'll just give you one example. Washington Post, 3,000 word story, Biden's falling poll numbers, his struggling year. I went and counted 43 paragraphs, 3,000 words. There was not one sentence about the 6.4 million jobs created, something no first year president has ever done since they started keeping records in 1939. No mention of full employment at 3.9%. So to me, particularly over the year anniversary, the press is really, really wed to this narrative. Traditionally, the metrics you use for judging a president in terms of economy, unemployment, jobs numbers, mortgage rates, home sales, consumer spending, all those metrics were excellent and continue to be excellent. But inflation, because we just had a global pandemic, was quite unusual and quite high. And so what the press did through the fall and the winter, they decided inflation was the economy. That's the only, that, if you wanted to understand the US economy, you only had to focus on inflation. And frankly, for the news and particularly television news, that's a really simple, compelling story to tell. You interview shoppers, you go to grocery stores, you interview people complaining about how high their bills are. Very simple story to communicate. And so that's the one they really went into. Spreading COVID is now the Republican Party's #1 priority. And that seems like an exaggeration, but when you go through it, it's hard to argue with that. And particularly now, we have the Supreme Court blocking mandates, the state Republican governors doing everything in their power to continue the spread of the pandemic.
Right.
But that's when I think a lot of them just became anti-vaccine. And I don't think a lot of people at the January of 2021 thought the Republican Party at the end of the year would essentially be anti-testing and anti-vaccine. But they did it because they were afraid Biden would get success. And so this is a culmination of decades, a couple decades in terms of a radical push within the Republican Party, obviously being fueled by Fox News and others, that a Democratic president cannot have any successes, legislative successes or anything like that. And you would think on paper, well, a pandemic's different, right? This is a public health crisis. We have nearly 1 million dead Americans. This will be different. They're going to set aside partisanship, but they didn't. And I think they feel like this is a success. They look at Biden's polling numbers, which are down. COVID numbers are still high. And honestly, I think they think that is a success. Liberal media bias was created during the Nixon administration. So the reason the press doesn't call it out is because it's too dangerous. You can't call the Senate Majority Leader a radical. You can't call the House Minority Leader, an authoritarian. They're so timid and they're so plugged in to the right-wing pushback that they're very reluctant to call this stuff out. I mean, yes, on the commentary on the pundit side, but it's just drilled into the Beltway press, on the news side and journalist side, that basically no matter what the Republican Party does, it's by definition within the mainstream. Right. A quick point, which I've said for years, every Beltway news cycle, every morning starts with the same premise, which is what are Republicans angry about today? And everything else springs from that, whether there's a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House. So Democrats see that and say, well, I don't want to be in the phony business. I'm not going to make up some scandal. I'm not going to invent some outrage that doesn't exist. And good for them. We don't want to be the party that invents outrage and smears people based on no evidence, the way the Republican Party is. So unfortunately, and I don't think there's any way around it, the Republicans own that. They own that. They're shameless. They are willing to traffic in lies and misinformation. And Democrats aren't. The problem, as you point out, Tom, is there's no reward for being honorable. There's no reward for being honest. As I said, the press loves, phony outrages. It gets people excited. You go demand, responses from Democrats. It puts them on the defensive. It's a whole easy news cycle. And another super safe way is to do the both sides. And it's basically a cop out. It's a way to not tell the honest truth about what was, and if we're talking about Trump, what was happening in this country. It's a way to kind of be mealy-mouthed about it. And it's a safe way because the press can step back if they get attacked, by Republicans or the conservatives. Hey, you're being unfair to Trump. The press can say, well, I just presented it as both sides. It's up to everyone else to decide. Trying to obliterate free and fair elections, that's not really there's not two sides to that. And that's going to be the challenge going forward for the next few years, particularly as Trump eyes, another run. That's not something you can kind of dance around. That's not something that can be ignored. The entire central premise of his reelection campaign is to do away with free and fair elections. They keep using Fox News as their angle, releasing these texts from the Fox News host. That generates a lot of media coverage. So, we're going to see public hearings. So I think the press is very receptive to that because it's all very straightforward information. Republicans don't really have a good response. There isn't really a counter push. They don't really have a good story to tell. So I think Democrats, particularly on the 1-6 committee story, they kind of have the whole landscape to themselves. And I think it's going to be a bigger story this year than a lot of the people in the press think. But I think it's just important to keep up the pressure, and Twitter is a great forum for that. Everybody reads their own tweets. Reporters used to be kind of walled off for the New York Times. They didn't have to interact with the public, and now they do. I pointed to that ray of hope with Trump canceling the press conference because he wasn't going to get enough coverage. So I think we're being heard. But sometimes I totally understand how it feels like we're not. But the option of not doing anything isn't really an option. So we just have to keep up the pressure. And, we do it in a factual way, unlike the conservative attacks on the press, which are usually personal and usually fictional. It's been a massive brain drain over the last 10 years at newsrooms, and particularly people with experience, and that would be editor positions and people who would have sent stories back and saying, are you kidding me? Like, well, the premise of your story, this doesn't make sense, or this headline is off. I think there's an urge to prove you're not part of the liberal media, prove you're not in the bag for Democrats, and it's easy to do that if you just want to drag the Biden administration and things like that. Vigilant and understand what you're reading and read between the lines. But in terms of pushback, conservatives are very hands-on. They reach out to the press, they reach out to reporters. They usually do it in an angry harangue. But if you do reach out to reporters, if you do reach out to news organizations, they might not respond, but they know that presence is out there. And we have to be out there. Otherwise, we're just leaving everything entirely to the other side. So in the old days, you'd write a letter to the editor. Now, there are other things, whether comments or tweets or getting in touch with reporters and editors or producers and things like that. So I know it feels sometimes helpless. And I know it feels like, things aren't changing, or they keep making the same mistakes over and over. But the press is very thin-skinned, luckily. I found reporters and journalists, and they don't like being called out, and they don't like their work being questioned. And so they hear, even if it doesn't seem like they hear and they see when their work is criticized.